The classroom at Fort Harper's long-range complex smelled like oil, dust, and coffee that had been sitting on a burner since 5:30 a.m. It was quiet, except for the low murmur of gear being unzipped and rifles being set down against the cinder block wall. 12 candidates stood around the briefing table, all in uniform, all selected for this phase of the multi-branch sniper training pipeline. Most were from Navy SEAL teams, a few from Army Special Forces, and all of them knew the next 2 days would separate the ready from the almost. At the front of the room stood Commander Brett Allman. 24 years in naval special warfare had carved the lines into his face and stripped the excess from his voice. He didn't waste time. Not with words. Not with people. Behind him, a whiteboard listed the first lane of evaluation: cold bore engagement, 900 yards, elevation and wind corrections unaided. 1 round only. Allman tapped the marker against the board as he spoke. The target was a torso-sized steel plate, standard silhouette, posted at the far end of range 12. Shooters would take the shot cold. No warm-ups. No second chances. Winds had picked up from the west, gusting at 17 knots, and were expected to stay that way. He turned to face the group. He asked who felt confident enough to make the hit. First round. Cold bore. No spotter. No adjustment. 3 hands went up. And then a 4th? It was a quiet motion, steady and unhesitating. At the far end of the room, Grace Halley stood in civilian layers, hair pulled back into a tight coil, hands rough from years of recoil and range days. Her ID badge hung plainly from a lanyard around her neck. No rank, no unit patch, just a last name and the word contractor. The room seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Allman looked over his shoulder, making sure he had seen what he thought he had. His eyes settled on her face, just for a second, then slid back to the others. He laughed. It was short and sharp, not cruel. Tout but dismissive. He asked if someone had checked the coffee situation, said maybe she could handle that while the adults talked shooting. A few of the candidates looked away. One shifted his weight and stared at the floor. Grace didn't move. She didn't smile. Didn't lower her hand right away. When she finally did, it was slow, controlled. She gave a small nod and walked toward the door. Nobody stopped her. The hinges clicked quietly as it closed behind her. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub grass along the perimeter road, flattening it in gusts and letting it rise again like breath. She stood just beyond the Conex box, where extra gear was stored. Her boots stayed rooted. Her face was still. She'd heard versions of that tone before, in units, in training courses, in meetings where she was introduced as an instructor, and someone's eyes immediately found the closest male. She didn't need to prove anything to the men in that room. Not yet. But someone would ask again, and when they did, she'd be ready. Grace grew up on 10 acres of wind-scoured land outside Lander, Wyoming. Her father, a retired Air Force pilot who had flown 8 seconds in the Gulf, built a small shooting range behind their barn. Nothing fancy, just some repurposed steel, old target frames, and enough open space to stretch a shot past 300 yards. By the time she was 10, she could hold a rifle steady in a prone position and read mirage lines dancing above the grass. Her dad didn't care much for formal instruction. He taught through repetition, wind flags, bullet drop, elevation holds. Every correction was a quiet conversation between her and the landscape. At 13, she could call wind shifts and adjust for distance at 400 yards without asking for help. She didn't brag. She didn't need to. The target told the truth every time. After high school, she tried the usual route. Community college in Riverton. 2 years of general courses, switching majors every semester. Nothing stuck. She wasn't built for classrooms. The structure felt soft. Too many moving pieces that didn't matter when you zoomed out. She wanted something harder. Something that didn't lie. She walked into the recruiting office at 10:15 a.m. on a Thursday. The Marine Corps sergeant behind the desk sized her up with a quick glance, like he'd seen 100 kids like her already that week. When she told him she wanted to do something that counted, he raised an eyebrow and handed her the paperwork. Boot camp was rough, but she didn't flinch. She passed through Camp Pendleton's School of Infantry with quiet determination. No one remembered her as the loudest or the fastest, but instructors remembered her shooting scores when a slot opened in the Scout Sniper screening course. Her platoon sergeant wrote the recommendation without asking. Sniper selection was brutal. Long days under a pack, endless stalks through sand and sagebrush. Strict evaluations that left no room for second chances. On the range, her scores were surgical. Her final stalk came within inches of being compromised. But she passed. She graduated top 5 out of 22. Grace didn't tell anyone back home. Her father already knew what she could do. She deployed twice to Helmand Province as part of Overwatch teams for combat engineers. The missions were tedious and tense. Long hours lying motionless, watching the same stretch of road through a scope, waiting for something that might never happen. She never took a shot that wasn't cleared by her team leader. That wasn't ego. That was discipline. Precision wasn't about pulling the trigger. It was about knowing when not to. She saw a few close calls. An IED team 2 hills over. One insurgent they never got a clean ID on. But she did her job. Each mission ended with the engineers intact. That was enough. When she left the Corps, it wasn't by choice. Force reduction swept through her unit, and junior NCOs with her MOS were cut. There was no drama, just a DD 214, a firm handshake, and a flight out of Pendleton at 7:20 a.m. She took a job at a civilian shooting facility just outside Grand Junction. Most mornings, she arrived before 6. She reset steel targets at long range and coached shooters who wanted to improve their fundamentals. She corrected grips, adjusted firing positions, and spoke only when something mattered. She didn't bring up her deployments, didn't mention sniper school. If someone asked where she learned to shoot, she usually said Wyoming. Her past wasn't something she wore. It lived in the way she handled a rifle, the way her eyes read wind before her hands made adjustments, the way she stayed calm in noise, in silence, in doubt. Grace didn't tell her story. She lived it, one shot at a time. The wind coming off the hills had teeth. Grace stood with her hands tucked into the sleeves of her jacket, leaning against the Conex box near the edge of the range. The grass flattened and rolled in waves, then lifted again like it was breathing. She watched it without blinking, tracking the shifts, marking the rhythm. Inside the tower, the first candidate took the line. Silence. Then the low crack of the rifle. Spotters called it wide left. About 20 inches. Grace didn't flinch. A few minutes passed. The second shooter rushed the setup, pressed too early, and sent the shot low into the dirt berm. He stood up stiffly and walked away without saying a word. The third candidate took his time. His position looked solid. The shot broke clean, but the round landed off the right edge of the target. Close, still not good enough. Nobody said much. The quiet held like a thick curtain. Nobody celebrated. Nobody joked. 3 tries. No hits. Grace didn't move from her spot outside. She wasn't cold. She wasn't nervous. The air spoke in flags and grass and shimmer. She was listening. Footsteps approached from behind. A senior chief from the Navy side of the cadre. He was calm. Face unforgettable. He asked if she really thought she could make the shot. She said yes. He studied her for a second, then asked why. She kept her answer simple. She'd trained with the M110 rifle system for over 7 years. She'd qualified expert on every range she'd ever shot with it. She understood this wind, not perfectly, but well enough to compensate. He didn't scoff, didn't smirk. He just nodded once and looked toward the tower. She waited. 10 minutes later, Commander Allman stepped out of the observation deck and walked across the gravel with a deliberate pace. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence stretch just enough. He said he heard she wanted to take a turn. She said she did. He told her the live fire supervisor had cleared it. But the condition was clear. One shot. Miss it. And she'd be removed from the contractor roster. No second chances. Grace didn't blink. She said that sounded fair. Allman gave a tight nod, turned, and walked back toward the firing line without looking over his shoulder. Grace followed. The wind hadn't dropped. If anything, it was pushing harder now. She glanced across the open distance to the far end of the range, 900 yards. One round. No warm-up. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. But something in the way she stepped onto the line said she wasn't here to ask for space. She was here to take it. The gravel crunched softly beneath Grace's boots as she stepped onto the firing line. The wind tugged steady from her left, pushing at 17 knots. Maybe more in the gusts. She didn't look around, didn't glance at the tower, or the other shooters standing back. She moved with quiet purpose, the kind that doesn't ask permission. One of the range staff handed her the Knight's Armament M110 SAS. The suppressor was cool. The optic wasn't hers. She registered that instantly. It had been zeroed and re-zeroed by other hands. That didn't bother her. She lowered to prone, elbows wide, knees out, chest down. Before anything else, she cleared the action. Bolt back. Chamber checked. Bore clean. She seated the magazine, confirmed the latch, then checked the mount on the scope. 2 firm presses at the base. No play. Suppressor snug. Turrets intact. She noted the setting, but she'd dial her own. She slipped behind the rifle and settled in. Her breathing slowed as her cheek found the comb. The reticle swam for half a second, then steadied. The silhouette target stood 900 yards out. Just above the shimmer, where the heat met the air, the mirage drifted left to right in slow motion. She watched it longer than most would. Mid-range boil. Some upward thermal, not severe. She ran the numbers in her head. Known cold-bore shift on this rifle setup pushed the first round about a half mil left. Distance plus environment gave her 31.5 minutes of elevation. She dialed it cleanly. Wind held at 2.5 mils into the breeze. She would hold, not dial. Natural point of aim came next. She adjusted her body by inches, checked it twice. Let her spine relax. Let her pulse fall into rhythm with the earth. Her finger rested gently on the trigger face. No pressure, just contact. She exhaled once. Then again, on the third breath, she held just before the bottom. The shot broke, like a door, closing in the distance. Soft. Decisive. The rifle rolled straight back. Not high. Not left. Grace stayed on glass. Through the reticle, she caught the trace. A faint silver line bending through the air. The spotter's voice came calm over the radio. A breath later. Center mass. Impact confirmed. Nobody spoke. Grace lifted her head and rolled clear of the rifle. She locked the bolt to the rear, removed the magazine, and placed the rifle on the mat, away from the line. Then she stood, dusted off her sleeves, and stepped back. The silence didn't break right away. Commander Allman walked to the tower and bent over the spotting scope. He adjusted the focus slowly, leaned in, stared long. When he finally stepped away, his jaw had tightened, but not in anger. Something had shifted behind his eyes. He walked to Grace. He asked her where she learned to shoot like that. She told him her dad taught her how to read the wind. The Marine Corps taught her everything else. Behind them, the senior chief gave a dry grin and looked toward Allman without saying much. Her resume's been in your inbox all week, he said. Allman didn't reply right away. He just looked at the target, then back at Grace. And this time, he really saw her. Commander Allman walked the length of the range with the steel target in hand. The center of the plate bore a single, clean impact mark, just left of the vertical midline. He stopped in front of the candidates, lifted the target chest high, and turned it toward them. His voice was calm, but there was weight in it. "This is what right looks like." No one said a word. He glanced back at Grace, still standing near the mat where she had cleared and set down the rifle. He asked if she'd be willing to coach the next round. No sarcasm, no smirk, just the question, plain. She gave a small nod. The wind held steady into the afternoon, and Grace stayed at the line, coaching quietly as each candidate stepped forward. She didn't speak much, only when needed. She corrected elbow placement, adjusted shoulders. She stood behind them as they read the flags and called their own wind holds, asking what they saw and how they'd respond. One candidate struggled to steady his breathing. She tapped the small of his back and reminded him to let his ribcage move, not his shoulders. Another kept breaking trigger too early. She slowed him down, walked him through a dry press. 3 of the 4 made solid hits. The 4th missed his first shot, but adjusted and tagged the edge of the plate on his second. That was enough to pass. Commander Ullman watched from the tower. He didn't interrupt. He didn't pace. He just watched. By 1600, the last shooter had cleared the line. The range crew began resetting equipment, and the candidates stepped back into the classroom for the next briefing. Grace started to gather her things. Ullman walked over and motioned for her to follow him around the side of the Connex, out of earshot. He kept his voice low. He said he was wrong. He said he should have read her file, should have judged her on performance, not on assumption. Grace shrugged slightly. She told him it was understandable. He shook his head, said it wasn't. There was a pause. Nothing awkward, just real. Then he told her she had a spot here anytime she wanted it. She nodded once, said she appreciated that. The following week, she opened her inbox at 7:15 a.m. and saw a new message flagged high priority. The subject line read, "Invitation to National Sniper Training Symposium. Confirm attendance." Later that day, her supervisor pulled her aside and told her the training center had renewed her contract. Her rate had been increased. No explanation was needed. Grace didn't tell anyone what had happened out at Fort Harper. Not her coworkers. Not the students she trained. She showed up like she always did. Before sunrise. Resetting steel. Checking zeros. Watching the wind curl through the frost. Whatever changed, it wasn't in her. It was everything around her finally catching up. It was still dark when Grace pulled into the range lot. The headlights cut across the frozen gravel and caught the corners of frost clinging to the fence line. She shut the engine off and sat for a moment, letting the silence stretch out before her. The clock on the dash read 6:02 a.m. The air bit deep when she stepped out. Breath turned white in the cold. She walked to the Connex and grabbed a single target from the stack inside, carrying it one-handed down the dirt path to the long-range pit. The sky had just started to fade from black to a washed-out blue, the kind that only came on clear, cold mornings. She mounted the target on the frame without rush. Everything about the motion was familiar. The backer, the clamps, the crease in the cardboard that always folded just wrong. She tightened it down and stepped back, checking the line. Her boots left crisp tracks in the frost. There was no one on the schedule that morning. No students. No other instructors. Just her and the wind. Grace moved to the firing position and laid out her mat. The rifle she brought was her own this time, zeroed last week, cleaned and inspected the night before. She didn't plan to shoot it, but she liked it close by. She dropped into prone and set up behind the scope, checking the glass out of habit. The reticle came into view. The mirage already started rising above the cold ground, drifting left to right, steady and smooth. The wind tugged across her collar and moved in soft bursts through the grass beyond the targets. She made a wind call under her breath, 2 mils at mid-range. With a slight boil from ground heat, Mirage shift just beginning. She held for it without thinking, as if she might squeeze the shot. But she didn't. She just breathed. Her father's words came back without effort. The rifle doesn't care. The wind doesn't care. Only the shooter does. He used to say that like it was a fact, not a lesson, a truth of the world. Grace had carried it with her for years. Through deployments and ranges and days like this one when nobody was watching, she stayed behind the scope a while longer. Eyes relaxed. Not searching for anything, just seeing. Then she rolled off the line, brushed her hands clean, and stood. No shot fired. No need. The wind had already told her what she came to hear.